Our next keynote is a fireside chat with FCC Commissioner Jeffrey Starks. With the coming of 5G, the fifth generation of wireless networks, what regulatory role can and should the FCC play in defending our networks from malicious activity by foreign adversaries? Ladies and gentlemen, to help us answer that question and more, Commissioner Jeffrey Starks and Professor Stephanie Pell, a member of the Army Cyber Institute and Assistant Professor and Cyber Ethics Fellow at the United States Military Academy.
Commissioner Starks, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to talk about some 5G. Let's do it. So let's do a little stage setting. 5G, the fifth generation of wireless networks, promises, by some estimates, internet speeds that are 100 times faster than 4G networks. 5G will empower new muscled-up smartphones and myriad IoT devices, enabling consumers to stream videos at rapid speeds and use smart glasses for augmented reality experiences. 5G will facilitate the arrival of self-driving cars, telemedicine applications that were once only the stuff of science fiction, smart and comprehensively observed cities, and numerous visionary services like cooperating intelligent drones engaging in search and rescue missions. The possibilities are numerous, but all the telecommunications carriers are in a race to see who can deliver 5G services first. But as we race to the future, we cannot forget the security-focused concerns of the present and the past. In fact, as former FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler has noted, networks have always been attack vectors. So why should we be surprised that the network of the 21st century is a new attack vector? We ought to respond accordingly. Now, you, Commissioner Starks, have proclaimed on numerous occasions since you became an FCC commissioner that network security is national security.
Yes.
I want to talk to you more about that and the specific kinds of threats to network security that concern you and should concern us all in the race to 5G. But first, for those in our audience who may not be familiar with the role the FCC can play in protecting the security of our networks, can you tell us a bit more about how you see the Commission's role and authority in this space?
Yes, of course. Well, thank you, of course, for having me here, Stephanie, and to CyCon as well. The first thing I'd probably say, just to orient folks, is the FCC Commission is an independent agency, and so we are a 5-member commissionership, and we are each presidentially nominated and confirmed by the Senate, and so we are each kind of our own leader in that way. And so I think I would caveat that by saying different commissioners would think differently about what is the fullest extent of our national security authority here. And so I'll state that at the front. What I think would be unanimously agreed to is that the FCC statutorily has a role here. Section 1 of the 1934 Communications Act says that we are the body that is commissioned to protect the communications networks, and that specifically includes national security. So there is definitely a role for us to play here. And how that is effectuated, I think different people would agree with, but certainly with regard to, we voted earlier this year on China Mobile's 214. A 214 is essentially their ability to operate as a carrier. China Mobile was applying to have the ability to operate in the United States. We ultimately decided against their ability to operate, but China Telecom, China Unicom still have the ability to operate in the United States. So 214s is certainly something. 5G and 5G security, something that hopefully we'll explore further in our conversation, is something that is clearly within our ambit. There are national security ramifications to 5G and how we protect it. IoT is another vector here. Two more things that I'd mention is underwater sea cables is something that under our statutory authority is assigned to us, and so we know that these underwater sea cables do also have, in particular, they are part of the attack plane with Russia in particular. There was an article in Forbes that was just talking about how there is a Russian espionage sea vehicle that is out there, and in particular they are working through sea cables. The last thing I'd mention is election security is something that I'm really focused on, and making sure that we have the most secure elections possible.
So the security environment has changed a bit
Yes.
since the 1996 Telecommunications Act was passed.
For sure.
Can you talk a little bit about that and the specific concerns you have with respect to the security of 5G today?
Yes. So certainly since the 96 Act, when you're talking about so much has changed from then to now. Back in the 96 Act, you really had a number of small carriers, and so there was very much a trusted interconnection, interoperability. And so network security really was not a particular focus at all. Obviously, as there's been an explosion of the number of operators, the number of carriers, the number of equipment, that has been something that has reduced price and generated competition, but it has also meant that you have a lot more people out there that are in control of these companies. And so that is something that we've had to think through, and it has really introduced the lack of that trust and interoperability that we're talking about. And so that's kind of on a very micro perspective. Something that I would say really quickly from a more macro perspective is China's real growth and dominance in this sector. When you compare even just 10 years ago, 2009, China telecommunications equipment constituted 6% of the global equipment that was being bought. Now they are well over 30%. In 2009, none of the internet companies that were the top 10 generators in terms of growth and revenue were Chinese. Now there are 4 out of the top 10. And so that rapid explosion and the ability of China to really quickly close the gap is something that a lot of us are still thinking through and trying to make sure that, in particular with regard to national security, as you talked about, making sure that we're thinking through how to deal with China and making sure that we have trusted carriers and trusted partners. I don't have to tell, obviously, folks in this room, you wouldn't want your defense planes, you wouldn't want your defense ships being built by what is a foreign adversary. And so very much on the theme of network security is national security, we really have to focus on our connections and our communications as something that we want to be with trusted partners.
So in that respect, you, the FCC, other parts of the government are very much focusing their efforts on concerns with keeping certain countries' communications equipment out of our networks.
Yeah.
Can you talk some about that, please?
Yes. There are a number of folks around the government that are focused on this issue. Obviously, starting at the top, the president in May of 2019 issued an executive order where, in particular, he leaves the details to be worked out through the Commerce Department. But ultimately, what that focuses on is making sure that we are not allowing insecure telecommunications equipment into the United States, and actually naming what those in particular companies are. It leaves to Commerce. But the whole point is that the president agreed and specifically issued an executive order that insecure and untrustworthy Chinese equipment, telecom equipment, should be kept out of the United States. The National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, of 2019 was legislation that was passed, and so Congress is focused on this issue. And what the NDAA does is it says that for federal procurement purposes, the government should not be purchasing insecure Chinese equipment. In particular, in the NDAA, they do name Huawei, they do name ZTE. So specifically as part of that legislation, they're named. The FCC has done a couple things. We have focused on the supply chain, which is something that we appropriate, for lack of a better term, almost $10 billion. A good number of that, almost $5 billion, goes to buying equipment that tries to get broadband everywhere. And so for our supply chain purposes, making sure that with federal dollars, we're not buying Chinese equipment that we view as insecure with universal service dollars. And so I'm a big fan of all of that. What I have focused on, though, is all of those are issues that are focusing on making sure we don't have insecure, untrustworthy Chinese equipment going forward. I have said and have long said that we can't view this issue asymmetrically, where we're only worried about keeping insecure equipment out. We need to focus on the equipment that we know we have already here in the United States domestically, and there are a number of domestic, in particular small rural carriers. Truth be told, AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile, Sprint, the big carriers do not have Huawei, do not have ZTE, insecure Chinese equipment in their infrastructure, but we do know that there are small rural carriers who do have a significant amount of this in their infrastructure.
So what do we do about that?
So that's the question, is what do we do about that? And that's a question that I have focused on during my commissionership. And what I have, I rolled out a program that I called Find It, Fix It, Fund It, which is kind of a three-part way to get at curing what is this domestic problem of insecure Chinese equipment. The Find It is trying to figure out what the universe of insecure and untrustworthy equipment is. The fact of the matter is that you don't have a lot of carriers raising their hand right now saying, I've got Huawei in my network. And so we do have to, yes, there's nobody doing that, trust me. And so we do have to figure out how to, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem, but trying to figure out how we have carriers that do have this in their infrastructure come forward and say, here's the infrastructure that I bought. The fact of the matter is that under our rules and under our laws, it was not illegal to purchase Huawei or ZTE equipment at any time. And so that is kind of the find it part. We really need to get our minds around what is the universe of this equipment out there. Then there's fix it, which is really kind of a, how do we remediate this and make sure that two real proposals have been out there. The first is monitoring. We know that there is Huawei equipment at Pine Belt in Mississippi in their infrastructure. Let's set up kind of a monitoring mechanism whereby if we see that any equipment is, let's say, translating back to China, sending information, data back to China, a little beacon will go off and we'll be able to know about it. The problem with that, of course, is that doesn't actually solve what is, potentially a data breach situation. The second real option that we have here, which I'm a fan of, which I have publicly stated I support, is really a kind of rip and replace. Which means we're literally going to have to go to where we know that there's insecure Chinese equipment, Huawei ZTE, and make sure that we rip it out, replace it with a trusted vendor. And I think that gives us a lot more security. Really quickly, the issues around that are that you're talking about equipment in some of the most remote areas of the United States. And so terrain, it's not easy to get out there. Lots of these places, it's hard to get out there due to weather concerns. You only may have some 6 or 8 weeks where you can actually get out there and replace all of the insecure equipment out in parts of rural Montana. And so there are concerns about how we would actually effectuate this.
And are there sort of threshold questions about
Yeah.
are prioritizing what gets removed? Or is everything, do we have to treat everything at the same level of threat? Or does different kinds of equipment present more significant threats? And depending on where the equipment would be deployed in a network, do we have to balance those equities in terms of prioritizing what you want to rip out first?
So that's exactly right. That's an extremely good question. And the answer is, like a lot of things, it kind of depends. I have a particular perspective that, when you're looking at a communications network, there are individual handsets. There is what is the radio access network, the RAN, and then there is kind of the core of the network where information is really distributed and routers and switches. As you move closer and closer to the core of the network, you get more, the ability to control data, to control information gets greater and greater. And so you have had folks who say, well, we don't really need to rip and replace the radio, the RAN. When you're talking about that, it's really just dumb equipment that just sends signals. Whereas the core of the network is what you really have to replace. And so ultimately, I think the questions really get down to not a question of do you trust any particular piece of equipment, but really the question is, do you trust who made that equipment? And this kind of comes back to first principles. There are really kind of a couple issues that have to be discussed. The first is insecure equipment could ultimately be used for espionage. China in particular, or a foreign adversary could monitor, could listen in on those communications. The second real issue is that during times of a national emergency, for example, or God forbid, a time of war, China could ultimately, if they can take control of those networks, stop those networks from flowing, choke off, stop communications potentially completely. Also could, back to underwater sea cables, could be able to control our information to our other allies internationally. And so some of those issues really kind of get there. I ultimately believe the question that we have to focus on is getting rid of insecure equipment, untrustworthy equipment generally. And so I think that is going to be replacing the core of the network, replacing the RAN of the network, and making sure that we have the security that I think Americans are going to demand. So
there's a third element of your plan, so I got to ask you, how are you going to fund it?
The funded piece is crucial and really gets back to the issue that I spoke about, which is that I think you are going to have a lot of issues. I have met with, as a commissioner, I've met the most with the domestic carriers that have purchased Huawei and ZTE in their equipment and in their infrastructure. I've probably met with, the universe again is unknown, it's probably somewhere between 40 or 50 or 60 small domestic carriers that have it. I've probably met with about 24 of them. These are folks that obviously say, we know we have a national security issue, we want to talk through the policy ramifications, talk through the business ramifications on that. And so we know that there are some carriers who do have Huawei that haven't come forward. I don't want to say that they have done anything wrong, but we know that they're figuring out the universe. You will have more people come through once the funding mechanism becomes more clear, is really the simple way to say this. In the House, there is a measure that appropriates about $1 billion for us to fund a rip and replace mechanism. In the Senate, the 5G Leadership Act, sponsored by Senator Wicker, the chairman of the Commerce Committee, has appropriated about $700 million for it. Questions of how much this ultimately is going to cost is something that people really are still trying to think through. And it gets back to the questions of fix it. If you only wanted to fix the core of the network, or if you only wanted to monitor Those would be significantly cheaper options. But if you want to rip and replace everything, that is going to take something, I think, that is going to be close to like $1 billion. And so Congress very clearly is going to have to step in here and help correct this issue. You know, one other thing that I'd mention to you is there are issues when you talk to a lot of small rural carriers. Somebody who bought Huawei, again, did not do anything wrong, did not violate any laws, did not violate any rules. But it's been clear now, probably since 2011, 2012, that there are concerns about Huawei. There are concerns about network carriers buying Chinese equipment. Those folks did so nonetheless. And so you do have some, I've started to hear from some small rural carriers who say, hey, I had the choice to buy the cheaper Huawei aspect, to buy what I knew was going to be cheaper equipment that potentially had some security issues, but I decided not to do that. I paid Nokia, I paid Ericsson the higher price. Hey, doesn't that seem unfair to me that you're going to pay for somebody who does have insecure equipment to get a brand new network, whereas, you know, I did the right thing as a business owner and didn't buy what I thought was something that was trouble and something that was clouded. I think that's completely fair. You know, my response would be two things. I mean, the first is good on you for doing the right thing in terms of your business.
Brownie points.
Brownie points, exactly. A lot of brownie points. You know, even more than that, I think I would say that this is an issue of national security. And so when you're talking about issues of national security, we simply don't look the other way. We say, regardless of where the equities may fall, we're not going to let this stand. And then the other third kind of component of this, I would say very briefly, is that it's not going to be easy to rip and replace. You are talking about, as I mentioned, between weather and issues of actually getting 5G out there. A lot of the crews that are going to roll out 5G are otherwise deployed, the labor workforce here. And so is there going to be a labor workforce to actually get out to rip and replace? That's something that's going to have to be kind of coordinated on a massive scale. But the real point is that you know, a rip and replace is going to cause some disruption to a network provider. And so it's not like these small rural carriers who have Huawei are just going to be rainbows and lollipops. You know, they are going to have some hard time in actually fulfilling what ultimately I think is going to be their obligation to us as American people.
So let's assume then that we are successful in finding, fixing, and replacing and funding.
Yeah.
And that is probably a big if.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as you have explained, this is going to be a very laborious process.
Yeah.
But from a national security perspective, I presume that you appreciate that our communications are at some point in time going to travel across someone's network that has what we would define as insecure equipment. As far as I know, even all of our foreign partners and allies aren't taking this same position.
Correct.
So we do have to be able to advance in a way that protects our communications, even if they are traveling over insecure networks. And in fact, I mean, we can't expect even American manufacturers to be perfect. There are going to be vulnerabilities that are found and exploited, even when people are acting with the best of intentions. So what do we do about that, specifically with respect to 5G? Because as I understand it, there are some optional security features that might help us with this problem.
Yes, again, an excellent question. You know, the first thing I'd say to part of the premise of your question is, you know, I do think we are trying to go to some of our other global allies and impress upon them the concern that we think from the United States perspective about what it would mean to have untrustworthy equipment in their infrastructure. And so I'll start with that. But I completely agree with you that even if we were able to wring out every last piece of Chinese equipment here in the States, it doesn't take long for you to find that you are, again, Huawei is literally the largest global supplier of telecom equipment in the world. And so you are not going to find places where this is not going to be able to travel. Again, interoperability and interconnection is a defining part of networks. And so we are going to have some of our information, some of our data, some of our communications travel to foreign allies over equipment that we're not comfortable with, that we think is untrustworthy. Some issue, the good news is from 5G's perspective, we are being more thoughtful, more intentional in thinking through security on the front end. When you're talking about 2G, 3G, 4G, we were always kind of looking back on how can we graft on some security issues. But here we've been much more thoughtful on the front end as we're starting to roll out 5G, so that's the good news. On the flip side, when we're talking about a world with IoT, there are going to be literally tens of millions of interconnected devices. And so the attack plane is so much bigger and broader. And so on the one hand, there are pros, on the other hand, there are cons that, the security attack surface is going to be so much larger. But we are thinking through some of these issues. Network virtualization is something that I think is really going to help. It really is having AI almost embedded in the network. And so you're almost going to have like antibodies that are going to be able to seek out and find. A lot of this is going to be automated. And a lot of this is going to be able to get automatically to the source of issues and deal with it even before what a human system would otherwise be able to do. Network slicing is something that a lot of folks are talking about. That's going to be able to kind of segment some of the network in a little bit in ways where you can have higher security on certain planes of the network, whereas if you were if you didn't want to have that heightened levels of security, you would be able to have that at other parts of the network. So I think network slicing. To come back to virtualization really quickly, there was an AT&T report that came out just this week. So I'm sure you all will jump on that. But really, what they talked about is only a third of network operators and carriers plan to use virtualization as a security mechanism. And so those of us that are very excited about it as another way that we can help security, I'm a little concerned to see that it doesn't seem like a whole lot of operators are going to take that up. And so I'm looking into that, kind of thinking through that. But really one of the thoughts that I would leave folks with here is, when we're talking about this macro issue of China, and security. These really are geopolitical issues in a way that we're going to be dealing with for quite some time. And 5G is very much the tip of the spear right now. But these same dynamics are going to play out over AI, over cloud computing. These are issues that are going to keep coming about. And we need to be thoughtful and intentional. All of this truly is part of a whole of government approach that we need to start to take towards network security and national security.
And as I understand it, since you're talking about these various new security features that are optional in 5G, perhaps a more simple one is carriers can encrypt data. I mean, is that something that perhaps shouldn't be optional or rarely should be optional?
Yes, I think, and back to, I think end-to-end encryption is something that a lot of folks are starting to think through. And back to election security. There are about 5 states, I won't name names, that actually use, turns out you have to have voter registration connected to the internet because a lot of folks need to be able to go on and say, well, where's my voting location? And so voter rolls have to be connected to the internet in a lot of ways. But we have about 5 states and districts that actually transmit election results using cable modems, which I think is really insecure and something that I know you have.
Modems, yes.
Yes, that's something that I know you have focused on and written about and thought deeply on is stingrays, and the ability to kind of intercept some of those messages and communications is something that worries me. And so trying to think through if there are encryption mechanisms that even within election security should be focused on, but I think you're exactly right.
Well, with 15 seconds left, I will take this opportunity to thank you very much for sharing some time and your thoughts with us, and we will all look forward into the future to see what you and the FCC are doing about 5G security.
Great. Thank you,
Thank
Stephanie.
you so much.
Great to be with you.